book that one might say about data and about India. It has these graphs on the cover. Would you mind? I mean, do you want to tell us a little bit about how the book came to be and the story behind the cover?
I'd love to. Thanks so much for having me, Mihir. And thank you to Takshashila. The book came out of two sorts of sets of experiences that had often been separate for me and that I now wanted to bring together. The first was my experiences as a field reporter covering all that a rookie journalist covers, which is being dispatched all over the country, all over the city first, and then all over the country to understand the levers of how things work in India. The second set of experiences emerged after I started specializing in data journalism from 2010 onwards. And while to my mind, these didn't seem like two separate sets of experiences, because ultimately the people who I had encountered all over the country were the people behind the spreadsheets I was now looking at. The two made perfect sense to me together. But I wanted to bring these sets of experiences together in a book to try and answer 10 big questions about the way things work in modern India, both through what good data can tell us, as well as what the data I have found through my field reporting misses or misleads or gets wrong or just doesn't exist altogether for. And I think, the first part is as important as the second. The whole numbers matter as much to me as the half truths do, because sometimes there is a sort of blanket skepticism or suspicion around numbers in India, to the extent that people feel that there are no numbers that you can safely rely on. There are no good surveys. Indian statistics are beyond hope, and there's nothing that we can say from data. So I did want to make the point that good data does exist, and let's separate the wheat from the chaff and look at what is actually good data, as well as bring in the half truths part, the questions that the issues that the numbers miss. The cover, all credit for it goes to a designer by the name of Nitya Subramanian, who's based in Bombay. I had worked with her a bit when I wrote for Scroll, and she had this clever idea of a visual pun using graphs, which we used often in the book and which I look at all the time, to bring in a sort of Pinocchio effect. And I suppose the idea is to say that people do lie with numbers, and there are lies in numbers, but there's also there are faces behind it, there are stories behind it. So that was her very clever visual pun on this. So that's really the story of how the book came together.
Fascinating. I mean, and I think there's also a tiny little story behind the spine of the book, and maybe you can talk about that as well. There are these words that are interspersed among the graphs among the bar charts.
Yeah, I don't think until I actually wrote a book that I had ever paid any attention to the spine of a book. Nitya would come up with suggestions and say, what do you think works better? And I had never ever thought about it. But now that, she, and as well, Saurabh Garge, who's the design editor at Westland, my publisher, the spine was his idea. Now that I think about it, on bookshelves, a book is always at least in my bookshelves, my books are always vertical, and I'm always tilting my head to look at the spine. And now that I have the title of the book sort of vertically placed in between the graphs, I realized I like it so much. I never realized how annoying it was to turn my head in bookstores.
Fantastic. And I can tell you from visits to bookstores that your book does stand out because of the fascinating cover. And I hope a lot of our listeners today also either have already picked up the book or will pick up sooner than later. So just to get into this, you talked about data journalism, and you also talked about a lot of data sources for India. And I was wondering if you could tell us about, like, starting from your time in 2010, you started looking at data. Where is this data coming from? What are the sources? What kinds of sources there are? And how has that situation changed, let's say, over the last decade?
Yeah, that's a great question. Also, because so much of data journalism resides in sources. When I speak to young people, students, people who want to get into data journalism, I really tell them that what I would love to do is share as much as I can about data sources, because I feel like it's 50% of the job, and it's sort of important to share this with more young people and more journalists. So the visual journalist, data journalist Gurman Bhatia, for example, who used to be with Reuters, has a publicly accessible page on her website in which she just has a huge list of Indian data sources. So I, suggest to anyone looking at Indian data to look up Gurman Bhatia and look up this resource that she's building. So I really began to encounter data sources, or even think about what data sources were, on the job. I had not worked on this much before. And when I started at the Times Insight Group, which was then a small team of reporters working on data at the Times of India in Delhi, my editor on the job would, so typically something would come up and I'd say, well, where do I look for it? And then he'd tell me. And what people like Gurman would love to do is to institutionalize this knowledge much more, so people have a better sense of where to turn to. So I'd say you could sort of broadly divide Indian data sources into entirely government data sources, then those that are entirely private, and then some that are sort of hybrid, in the sense that maybe they are typically government sources, but they have been made accessible by private groups, or there's sort of cross tabs or triangulation that's being done by private groups. And that's something I'll be happy to talk about a little bit further as we go along, because this process of liberating data, sometimes government data, but liberated by private individuals, is a very sort of inspiring trend of the last couple of years. I have come to rely on these public spirited people greatly, and it's one of the great partnerships of the last couple of years. It's a privilege and a joy to be part of these sorts of groups. So I'll be happy to talk about them a little bit more going further. So the key Indian government data sources are the ones that we all sort of know about: the census, the National Sample Survey that I rely heavily on, the National Family Health Survey, these sort of big government-run surveys. And I want to be very clear that for me these are the gold standards, because they conduct nationally representative surveys at a size and scale that few private agencies do, and the private agencies that do this then put a premium on it, right? They often don't make it publicly available. So this is a great public good. And again, I want to repeat the fact that those who come at these numbers with skepticism or suspicion, and there's great reason to do it. A lot of excellent economists do a good job of finding errors, or things that these surveys should be looking at. But you should come at it with a sort of razor focus rather than a broad suspicion of it all, because these are highly pedigreed. This is a highly pedigreed statistical architecture. It's a great project of Indian independence. We were the envy of not just the developing world, the world coming out of the shadow of colonialism, but many developed countries too turned to India. We had a national household survey at a time where few countries across the world did, and the pedigree remains. There is some amount of institutional rot that has happened. There is some amount of underfunding, but these are impressive institutions, and being impressed by them and being skeptical can go hand in hand, and ideally that's what I would encourage more people to do. I think again we can talk about private sources a little further on. There have been a few impressively large new sources of private data, including the India Human Development Survey, which again, because it is conducted by an academic institution, the University of Maryland, and the NCAER, is a public resource. And the CMI's Consumer Pyramid Household Survey, which is going to be a growing, a source of data that I see being used more and more every day. And of course, an issue for debate is how to think about more key data coming from a closed private source, and what that means for democracy. And then there's also smaller surveys, which I tend to refer to in the book as to drill down on a broader point that bigger or broader survey data makes. So I wouldn't typically use a survey of one city or one state to make a big point about crime in India in general. But if there's some things that emerge about crime in India, then looking at well done qualitative surveys by academics who are well known and have published becomes a good way to add sort of granularity to large scale data.
I think that's a very important and good start to the session, because we are going to go through a few of the excerpts from your book, some of the diagrams and so on. And in each of these cases, you have referred to one of the data sources you spoke about or similar data sources. And I think it's important to understand that even the government produces data in multiple different ways. So the government conducts the surveys and the census, obviously, and that's where people actually on the ground go and enumerate statistics for the government. For the census, there's a bunch of questions that allows the government to get a sense of the population, a number as a whole, but also other attributes of the population. And with the NFHS and other surveys like that, the government can get more real-time data on how health is changing in India, how nutrition is changing, and things of that nature. So that's one survey part, but the government's administrative records themselves, to the extent that they're made publicly available. Also, I mean, for example, the birth and death registries, some of those data are available. And that also kind of matters, because a lot of times what we'll see is even within the government, there can be discrepancies between the administrative records, what they say, versus what the reality on the ground as captured by the surveys might be. And we'll hopefully see some of the examples. So I do want to start, Rukmini, with by sharing some findings from your book, just a preview for some of our viewers to get a sense of where we are in terms of things. So I wanted to start with children's health, just because that's kind of the future generation we are looking at. And you mentioned in your book that the share of stunted, wasted, and underweight children has grown in majority of states. And this, I believe, is from the first round of the most recent National Family Health Survey. But could you talk about that? And I believe the most recent round has come up with some contradictory data. So first of all, I mean, can we just start with maybe just a basic understanding of what stunting means?
So the reason stunting matters is because a lot of people working in health have begun to see it as a sort of bellwether indicator that captures more than what the indicator alone captures. So stunting alone is supposed to capture the difference between a child or an adult's height for their age compared to what would be expected for that population at that age. I think I too and many people sort of assume that heights are entirely to do with genetics. And much later, I came to the sort of realization that, that there's a portion, and we know the portion well now, of stunting that can be explained by genetics. And then beyond that, there's a range of variation that genetics do not explain, and other factors explain quite well, in fact. Stunting is one of those health indicators that we have seen make pretty impressive. India has made pretty impressive progress in this over time, although the rates of stunting remain, sort of unacceptably high for a country that made the growth that it did in the 2000s. And there are also significant differences between states. There's been a sort of interesting growth in the conversation around stunting as well, which is, as I said, at one point, it was considered to be purely a result of genetics. And I think, some of the important contributions to the study of stunting in the last few years have included, one, the role of sanitation and, the extent to which the intensity of open defecation in an area can explain stunting. And this seems like a no-brainer the more you think about it, because if a child is falling ill repeatedly and having bouts of diarrheal disease in the first couple of years of her life, it's going to affect her potential to develop to the height that she could have if she'd had all the nutrients, sort of remain in her body. We're also seeing great work around the role of intra-family inequities. So the differences in younger daughters-in-laws children as compared to older daughters-in-law who face a significant nutrition deficit while they are pregnant. We're also seeing the role of caste differences. I mean, one sort of largely unacknowledged fact remains that upper caste children in India are much likely to grow far taller than scheduled caste children in India. And there's an interesting sort of natural experiment that occurred with the creation of Bangladesh, which is although in the years after the creation of Bangladesh, West Bengal, now of course Bangladesh's income has grown too, but for those 20 or so, 30 or so years after that, um, families in West Bengal were more likely to be richer than those in Bangladesh. However, Bangladeshis had made greater improvements in height than those in West Bengal. And a large part of the explanation could have been the fact that open defecation, Bangladesh did an exceptional job of controlling open defecation by building low-cost solutions. So yes, actually, this is one of the, and I'm glad you brought up the question about the first and second phases of the NFHS. So the National Family Health Survey, which was finally conducted in 2019-20, was then interrupted by the pandemic, and then the second phase of states could only be taken up in 2021. In a sense, it raises some interesting questions about what happens when a survey gets split like this, and especially when what's splitting it is not an event without consequences. It's a monumental, earth-shaking event. And much as I'm interested, and many people are interested in studying the outcomes of the NFHS data, I think we also are going to find interesting observations potentially in the future about the very act of surveying. We're going to find some statistical questions from the NFHS data. So I'm just going to, because this hasn't yet been studied and I can't say much about it yet, but I am going to say that there are significant differences between the outcomes in the NFHS's phase 1 and phase 2, not all of which can be easily explained away. So let me just say that there are questions around it without sort of trying to ascribe why this is the case. So the story that emerged out of the first round of the NFHS was a substantial increase in stunting in multiple states. And if you had taken the average of those states at that point, it would have, converted it into a pan-Indian average, it would have shown an overall rise in stunting in India. These states that were divided were not divided in any specific way. We weren't doing richer states first, poorer states later. That wasn't how it was. It was largely random. But the second phase of the NFHS has found the opposite of this. And what this has done to the overall national story is that there is an overall reduction in stunting if you look at the national average. So without getting into the questions of the data, what we can at least sort of agree on is that we have not reduced stunting at a fast enough pace than we should have at the levels of growth that we experienced at least during the 2000s. And because this is an indicator that captures multiple realities, from income growth in an area to women's positions in the family and in the society at large, to caste differences and also sanitation, it's a particularly important indicator to focus on.
I think, that's the reason I wanted to start the conversation with it, is because over the last decade, and particularly since some of the earlier cleanliness missions were renamed and combined into the Swachh Bharat mission in 2014. And the government in 2019, through its administrative records at the Swachh Bharat portal, announced that India was open defecation free. But the NFHS, in addition to stunting, also covered access to latrines and access to toilets for people all around the country. And I believe they came up with a different number. And I think this shows a little bit of a power of different ways of looking at the same metric, while the government, which spends money and works with local administrations, work on constructing toilets for people. And then eventually, after the construction is completed, reports that India is 100% open defecation free. That's based on availability of toilets, as opposed to the NFHS, where my understanding is the surveyor actually on the ground goes and visits a village or a city area, and actually tries to determine what proportion of people have access. Could you maybe talk about those two differences as a data journalist?
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad you asked that. I feel like I could talk about the differences between, not the differences, sort of political questions and the questions for data in general that come up with administrative data. I could talk about it for ages. So this has always been an issue, that there is a discrepancy between administrative data and between data that comes out through household surveys and questions asked on the ground. Some of this is the difference between infrastructure and its use. So a toilet being built does not translate into it being used. So we do see some of that. But some of it also is all of the incentive structures that are built into misreporting administrative data sort of fall apart when it comes to the question being asked at the household level. And that is something that this discrepancy exposes. And the reason this becomes particularly important now is because I am seeing a growing emphasis on the use of administrative data, particularly when household data produces unflattering outcomes. So the Swachh Bharat numbers is not the only time that this happened, though this was very clearly demonstrated then. We saw this as well in 2019 when unflattering unemployment data came out, which showed, a 45-year high in rates of unemployment, decline in female labor force participation. All of that came out from an SSO report, which asked people at the individual household level, how long they've been working, what jobs they have, that sort of thing. And what we were sort of offered as alternatives was EPFO data, payroll data. Now, no respectable country or no respectable country's economist anywhere in the world would turn to payroll data to answer fundamental questions about the nature of employment in the economy. So, administrative data has its place, but that place is quite or needs to be quite neatly circumscribed so that it doesn't have the sort of mission creep into everything. Because honestly, for a government, what's easier than producing administrative data? Every act of government produces administrative data and doesn't require this separate effort. So I would be very wary about the sort of mission creep that's going on with administrative data in India. And I would also say that state governments are very enamored of their own administrative data themselves. I often have people in state governments talking to me saying, we produce all of this data and we don't know what to do with it. Well, a lot of it is not very good. The administrative data that state governments produce are riddled with errors right from the data entry stage. So there's certainly a lot that they could do with it, but there are huge holes in administrative data as they exist right now. Again, it can be a great accountability mechanism. So I would absolutely not throw it out, but on its own, it's a hard one to trust, particularly in India.
I think, that's a good point, is to not all data is created equal, and it's important to look at multiple sources, look at the validity, look at the way the data is produced, the mechanisms by which the data is produced in order to judge its reliability.
Absolutely.
So I have run a poll here about wage earning women in urban India, and let's see the results before we go on. So most of our audience thinks, and that's 31 out of 52 people that voted, thinks that the most common job of a wage earning woman in urban India is of domestic help. And I'm glad to say that they are actually right. That and this is a chart from your book. This is from the Periodic Labor Force survey, I believe, from 2020. And what I wanted to point out is the audience was asked about the wage earning women, but interestingly, the wage earning men have a very different profile of jobs, work in construction, retail, taxi and auto services, and so on and so forth. So one thing, Rukmini, I wanted to one thing that struck out is that these surveys, that the top 5 professions, if you look across men and women in urban India, the only one profession is kind of mapped to what one might call as an industrial job or a factory job, a manufacturing job, which is the clothing manufacture. In the case of women, domestic help, primary or secondary education, retail sales, these are all services sector jobs where people, and in case of men, again, construction is an on-site job where oftentimes migrant labor or even within the city labor will move around construction sites. And taxi and auto service, retail sales are all service jobs. So my question to you, and is, this is a relatively recent data from 2020. Why do we see that people in urban India, factory jobs are not showing up as the #1 category? And especially now that we are into year 7 or 8 of the Make in India kind of mission. And we know that in rapid industrialization produces a lot of jobs and lifts up the economy, as well as creating kind of more equality, or offering more access to wages for people. Why do you think, I mean, one, is this data reliable? And two, what's happening with factory jobs in India?
I do think it is reliable, and it's not something that one individual survey showed. This appears in when I was writing the book. In fact, I had an older PLFS, and then a newer one came out, and I updated the numbers, and all that changed were the numbers. The categories did not change at all. Um, uh, for women in particular, your audience, I think, is a particularly engaged audience, but this is something that otherwise people tend to find surprising. We think of ourselves as a white collar nation, and I think one of the things I like to remind people through these job categories is to try and think of who the bulk of your workforce is and what work it is that they do exactly. And also, I mean, just to think of it in a broader sociological sense, if the most common job for women, working women in India, is to essentially sort of subsidize the labor of other people in a household, it says something about the basic structure of everything from the economy to the social structure. It's a sort of a stark reminder of inequality as well. So I think all of the underlying assumptions that would expect us to see more factory jobs are the ones that we should be questioning. Have we seen reliable data on the extent of industrialization to expect these jobs to exist? I don't think so. Are we seeing the sort of economic growth that we would expect as a result of a big increase in manufacturing jobs? We're not seeing that either. And again, even for men, these categories are quite stable over time, particularly construction. So I suppose, to me, who sees this more in terms of long-term job categories, these strike me as particularly stable categories. And the question we should be asking ourselves is, if we imagine the economy in a different way, then what is it that led us to imagine it in that way, right? Are there other narratives that we are believing that are not really played out in the data? And again, this is somewhere where I want to bring up the question of administrative data and sort of other questions around data as well. When the 2019-20 employment data came out, one of the sort of the pushback against it from a lot of people was that, well, that's not what the economy looks like. People bought so many cars and bikes last year. What were they doing with that? Or, one of the arguments was, are you seeing the number of Ola and Ubers coming up? Who's driving those? So I think it's good to remind ourselves that when reality seems disconnected from what the data is saying, it's as good an idea to recheck what we think of as reality as it is to recheck the data itself. So, if using a lot of Uber and Ola is giving us a skewed sense of what jobs or the economy look like, perhaps that means that's a sort of bubble effect that operates in multiple areas of the economy that I talk about in the book as well. Just the question of, and I know you're getting to it in a bit, but the question of class and how much money we make as well, right? It's one of the great lies that we all tell ourselves.
Interesting. And I think the last point on how people work in India is, I found this quite fascinating. A lot of us don't realize this, that we are a hardworking country. Can you maybe talk about this? And it's a bit of a surprise to me that we work the longest hours of almost any nation in the world.
So I think this, in a sense, has a lot to do with what the world of work and jobs looks like for most people, which is when you start to think of how many people are self-employed, and self-employed in enterprises that are essentially single person or at most household enterprises, using unpaid family labor from another couple of people in the house. These are jobs that never end, in a sense. You're working until you go to bed. So, I used to always be struck by people, women as well, who would be, sleeping outside the railway station in Mumbai when I worked there at the time with vegetables, waiting for the early train in the morning. And it really strikes you that they've been working right up till absolutely to the last train runs, and then sort of prepared to take the next train in the morning. And if you talk to even people sort of on work sites for a major construction job, it's quite a reality check to understand how long they work. The other sort of companion thing that goes along with this for me is the fact that a day off is not really an Indian concept. The majority of Indians work more than 6 hours, 6 days a week, and having a day off is an uncommon event. And this also strikes me when it comes to elections, and when we talk about low voter turnout. A legally mandated weekly off exists, but we know from the data that most people work longer than 6 days a week. So similarly, a legally mandated day off for the election exists, but it's an interesting sort of thing to think about and maybe work more on and write more about is the number of people who simply don't get to take time off work on election days, for instance.
I think you bring up an interesting point. I think our democracy is affected by some of these inequalities in society. The ability, I mean, one person, one vote is a guaranteed right, but the ability to exercise it is kind of affected by all of these factors. Whether you are actually at the place where you're supposed to vote, there is a lot of migrant workers in India as well, as we realized.
Right, and this also brings me to the issue that I, talk about in the book multiple times of narratives versus what the data actually says. So, at election times, and I sort of live in the world of narratives quite a bit by default because I'm in the media. The media sort of, its job is to has become to sort of live by narratives in a way. And one sort of beloved media narrative is that to sort of whip up a bit of middle class outrage, or not middle class, to whip up a bit of rich outrage, is that it's the rich in south Bombay, South Delhi. I don't know what the equivalent for Bangalore would be. The rich in I don't know, Indira Nagar. I'm not sure what the equivalent is. Who don't vote on election day, and they look at those constituencies, and that's how they determine that. But again, sort of household level surveys, smaller surveys in particular, say that if you look at a sample of people and you ask them, did you vote? And if you didn't vote, what was the major reason that you didn't vote? The biggest reason that people will say is that they were not there, in the place where their vote was. And this was most likely to be migrant men. So similarly, these are sort of interconnected shoots, but also the question of voter turnout. So we celebrate the increase in female voter turnout, as we should, but I do think we need to be asking a question around plateauing male voter turnout. Why is male voter turnout not increasing? And I strongly believe that the data indicates that it's because migrating, especially on a short-term migration for work, is more a male phenomenon, and these are the men who are missing out on the electoral process.
It's interesting you should say that also. Just as a temporal anecdote, is just last week there was news that the Punjab chief minister actually requested the election commission to reschedule some of the election days in Punjab, because apparently a religious pilgrimage day overlaps with the day of voting, and he was afraid that particular groups of people that observe that day are going to be unable to cast their vote. And obviously there are political considerations, but it's a fascinating thing to know that different reasons affect different groups of people differently when it comes to voting rights. But interesting, I mean, the other thing I want to bring us to now, and I'll close this poll here. We asked the audience what percentage of Indians file an income tax return. And I'm actually happy to note that our audience is actually quite right. Most of our audience thinks less than 3%, and some of them think between 4 and 5% file income tax returns. And Rukmini, you go into this in your book. You talk about a very low percentage of people who file income tax returns. And the reason we kind of brought in that question was we wanted to show this chart from your book. And again, this is about wage earnings for majority of Indians. And you make the point that the vast majority of Indians make very little money. As we can see, I mean, this is data from 2004 and 2012, so about a decade ago. But as we can see, the distribution is very, very skewed. There's a very small percentage of population that makes reasonable, that makes wages that amount to six figures in 2012, which is not that long ago. And there's a large distribution of people here. I wanted to contextualize this a little bit in light of the income tax returns question that we put in, is that the Manrega scheme was brought in 2005, the law came in, and then it came out, the actual scheme launched in 2006. And it promised, like it guaranteed 100 days of wages, labor, 100 days of work for whoever who asked for it at a particular wage rate that was guaranteed by the government and within kind of a particular distance of the place that they live. So between the Manrega guaranteeing that, and I plotted this out at in Karnataka, the rate in 2011, 2012 was 130 rupees a day. And so if we have a worker working 300 days, which is the 6 days a week that the average Indian works, they would be making 39,000 rupees, which would place them somewhere here. But obviously the real distribution from the same time period shows that majority of people are not making that. And in fact, the employment guarantee scheme only guaranteed 100 days, which would put them here. And of course, they would be working on other things in the remainder of the year and maybe earning a little bit more. But even with an employment guarantee scheme, we seem to see a lot of Indians earning very little by way of income. And then the second part is this also coincides with, this period coincides with 20 years after the economic liberalization, as well as the first decade of the new millennium, which was by all means high growth year, highest growth recorded in independent India. So it's interesting to see this chart from that perspective and see the inequalities or the lack of income for a large percentage of the population.
So I think that the income tax question, in a way, sometimes we tend to frame it around the fact, around the question of why do such few people pay income tax, while the combination of the two charts that you put together immediately sort of modifies that question to why do so many people make so little money that they cannot pay income tax? Because that's clearly what your chart 2 shows you, that your sort of 99th percentile is the only one who would be able to pay tax. So you can see why that's happening. And of course, it's also important to reiterate the fact that we're talking about income tax and indirect taxes paid by everyone, the poor included. So I don't want it to seem as if I'm making the point that the poor don't pay tax. I find it is frustrating that we don't have income data after 2012. India does not officially collect income data. It only collects data on consumption, which it then uses as a proxy for income. And there's a long conversation with a lot of pedigree about the difficulties of collecting income data. And there are many economists who say that even though it's hard, it is something we should attempt, while India's official statistical architecture and the officials there have laid out to me the difficulties with measuring income, and I get it. It does seem really hard. Part of the reason it seems very hard is that most Indian families rely on multiple sources of income, most of which give very little income except salary. A salaried income is the one sort of substantial addition to a household kitty. The rest is sort of bits from a little business, a little agricultural income, that sort of thing. So I can imagine how it becomes then an accounting nightmare, and it becomes, especially when it comes to agricultural income, that isn't a sort of daily wage sort of thing. It needs to be calculated much more carefully. I can see how it's hard, but perhaps it is a worthwhile enterprise. The good news also is that the India Human Development Survey is now in its third round. So we should have the most recent, when they're able to complete the survey, we'll have the most recent income data that we've had in 10 years. We should have it in a couple of years. I think it's important also to look at this distribution to think about what we're talking about when we're talking about inequality. In India, we're not really talking about the top 10 or 20%. I saw that there was a recent piece. I think it must have been based on Credit Suisse's projections around income inequality, which is something that Oxfam and the World Economic Forum typically use. And I saw it shared widely with a lot of shock. I mean, the top 20% of the country is not really the question to consider when you think about inequality. The top 0.02 or the top 0.2% of the country is really what we should be thinking about when it comes to inequality, because if you can go right to the top and still be, making in just about the lower six digits of annual income, that does not place you in the category of the rich. I have ended up seeing, I have a section in the book as well around the middle class, which is something that I think is a deeply misunderstood concept in India. A lot of people call themselves middle class when they're not, they're really the super rich. And even what we try and sort of understand as a conceptual category of what a middle class should look like defies all of those categories in India, because this is not a true middle class. It's essentially at best a non-poor segment. So the way I see it in India is that we have a large poor segment, we have a large non-poor segment, and this is a pretty precarious non-poor segment. And we saw that, played out during the returning migrant exodus that happened after the first lockdown. Those were your precarious non-poor. Some of them were poor, but many of them would have been people who would not have been officially classified as poor, but that is how precarious their jobs were, that their lives were, that a week of no wages meant that you had to physically walk from the south to the north of the country. So I see it more as poor, non-poor, and the super rich that we all really belong to.
Quite a depressing picture, and I think it has something to do with the lack of industrial jobs that we talked about earlier. The fact that the top 5 professions in urban India includes only one category of manufacturing jobs is interesting. Next question kind of gets to the gender aspect of employment and workforce participation. So we asked a question to the audience that 75% of working age men who are age 15, participate in the workforce, meaning either they are actively employed as defined by the employment survey, or they are looking for work and becoming considered a part of workforce. The same percentage for women. Our audience today, I must say, is incredibly knowledgeable. They got this one right also, though it's a very depressing statistic that only less than 30%, I believe the real number is close to about 21%, according to your book, of women participate in the workforce. As this slide shows, we are among the bottom countries in terms of women's employment or women's participation in the workforce. We are kind of in combination with some of the most regressive regimes or most failed regimes, sometimes people might call them. And then the other picture that emerges is the women's participation is getting worse over time, according to the government survey, the National Sample Survey, that it has fallen dramatically in the last 20 years or so, especially in the rural areas. So again, like this explores, Rukmini, in your book, the gender aspect of inequality, or in this case. But are there kind of systemic reasons, or are there other aspects that can explain this data, that this is not really a fall in women's participation, but being explained by some statistical anomaly?
So there's a few explanations, and I imagine that they all sort of contribute towards some of the explanation and variation or changes over time. However, the broad picture is what it is, and I'll get to that broad picture at the end of it. In terms of questions around the data, there's one question around the data, and there's one sort of non-obvious explanation. The question around the data is something that has been raised by the demographer and political scientist Sonal Desai. So she has suggested that as NSSO enumerators have become contractual over time, they are less able to ask questions as well as they could in the past. And because the IHDS, which she oversees, the India Human Development Survey, captures a slightly higher rate of female labor force participation, and smaller surveys too did than what the NSSO did. She has suggested that it could be that the NSSO is not capturing enough of women's work by not asking enough questions, because women's work is often fragmented. It's what is paid and what is not is often not clearly defined. You might have been working for what share of the previous period. Those, it tends to be more sort of amorphous in that way than a clearly defined job that more men might have. Um, One of the other issues that both Sonali Desai and the economist, the labor and feminist economist Ashwini Deshpande have been suggesting in the last 6 months or so also, is that we also need to think about the quality and quantity of jobs that are available for women, and then whether women choose to take on those jobs, whether it works for the other sort of aspects that women must navigate, whether then a job and the wage rates that go with those jobs make it worthwhile to do that work. But to me, at the bottom of all of this, and to me actually not really at the bottom, at the top of all of this, is the fact that social norms continue to dictate that the place of the woman is in the house, and that childcare and taking care of the house is a woman's primary responsibility. There are also all of these notions around women's purity and safety, which needs to be sort of protected at all costs, all of which makes exiting the house for paid work fraught territory that often has little to do with the economy and has more to do with social structures. This, I tend much more towards this explanation than others. I have also seen it sort of in operation in conversations with women, both in cities and in rural areas. These social and economic issues do come together. So one of the explanations by a group of ILO economists that appealed to me was the way of thinking of it is also that social norms dictate what work it's okay for women to do and not do. Social norms also dictate what education it's okay for women to take and not take. And those jobs are not necessarily the ones that are in fast growing sectors of the economy. So if women are going to be concentrated in caregiving and those jobs which perhaps might not, or sort of artisanish jobs which are not faster growing sectors of the economy. This was what some of their work showed. These two, the social norms and the economy come together to keep women out of it. So yes, there are all of these multiple explanations, but I come down on the side of the norms around what it's okay for a woman to leave the house for. The IHDS, for example, shows that uh, a majority of women, I think, as of 2011-12, needed permission to visit a health center, to visit a doctor, needed permission from someone in the house. So if you still need permission to leave someone for medical conditions, getting that permission to leave for a paid job, which might not always pay well enough to make it worthwhile for the family, given childcare, etc., just doesn't seem to add up, all of it.
So I think, I mean, there are a lot of very complex social factors and norms that go into this. Suffice it to say that while we have constitutionally kind of put equality in the constitution and so on, the social reality on the ground remains quite difficult for women, especially when it comes to their economic freedoms, as we talked about now. I think I wanted to explore another aspect of your book. Again, you go into the caste aspects in fair bit of detail of the fact that so scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, some of them are less likely to have lower heights than forward caste men, is what you say in some places. Here you say the forward castes are the richest, and with household income nearly 1.5 times the Indian average, and that there is evidence that quotas can improve outcomes. I wanted to go to something Ashwini Deshpande, whom you referred to, published a couple of years ago, and that's a live issue right now, which is that the government introduced a 10% quota for economically weaker sections. And they defined the households as with less than rupees 8 lakhs as annual income. What Ashwini Deshpande states here, and this matches up with the 2012 data, even accounting for the inflation and the change in the value of the rupee. I think Ashwini Deshpande says that as of 2015, 98% of all households earn 6 lakhs or less. So that wouldn't have changed substantially by 2019. So the rupees 8 lakh as the definition of economically weaker section, and then with that quota also stipulating that the otherwise socially marginalized groups, the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and the other backward classes, which have been given reservations quotas in government initiatives, lose out on that. Ashwini Deshpande actually says that this overturns the original logic of reservations. And yeah, I mean, I think with putting the income and the caste equations together, I mean, what's your take on this live issue?
Thank you very much for this. Again, something that I'm always happy to talk about. There is a great sense of often of victimhood in media narratives, which is not often borne out in the data. As Ashwini Deshpande's work here, which you pulled up, shows, if there is, and I'm not saying that she made this point, this is the point I'm making, but if there was sort of numerical justification for any group apart from those currently that receive affirmative action, for any other group to receive it, it would be in numerical terms Muslims, because Muslims are far poorer than forward caste for sure, but then some other backward Hindu groups as well. Muslim mobility has been absolutely stagnant and in fact even fallen over time. And there is, forward caste, we should sort of repeat this point till it becomes clear, is that forward castes are significantly richer than all other social groups. And I just wanted to read a section from the book to talk about this intersection of caste and jobs as well. And this looks at IHDS data. I was talking, the point I was making here was about government jobs and the difference between government and private, which is that government or public sector employment also serves as a moderating influence on other forms of social inequalities that market forces exacerbate. While women earn lower salaries in both public and private sector, and I mean this for the same job than men, the ratio of female to male salaries is considerably higher in the public sector than in the private sector. Similarly, salary inequalities among various social groups are larger in the private sector than in the public sector. And this is the point I want to focus on. Regardless of the sector, forward castes have higher salaries than OBCs, Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims. And I mean this for the same jobs. But the differences in government salaries by social group are lower in the public sector at both lower and higher skill levels. I don't feel like all of this is sort of reached the point of established fact at all. We don't think about or talk about enough wage differences for the same job for men and women, for forward castes and backward castes. And we also do not talk about exactly the chart that you pulled up, which is from research by Sam Asher and Paul Novosad, who have looked at this issue over time. The question that they're looking at over here is actually using educational mobility as a proxy for other forms of mobility by looking at the rank obtained, the likelihood of the rank that a father would obtain, that a son would obtain as compared to father over time. And they're showing that their argument is that we do see some of the impact of affirmative action for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in terms of improvements in mobility over time, but what we see is an actual decline in social mobility for Muslims. So in sort of bare terms, this would be that the likelihood of a son doing better than the father rose for other groups but fell for Muslims over the period under consideration. And it's not just a period of growth, but it's also it's not a direction that you would naturally expect any group in any society to move in over time. And it's certainly not something that we've spent enough time talking about. I argued this at the time of the when the 10% reservation was proposed then too, which is that numerically, if there is a group in India that has a sort of claim over a new quota, I just can't see how it's possible to argue for it to be anyone else than Muslims in India.
Um, Thank you for that. And I think you brought up kind of all the different axes along which our democracy can be considered imperfect, or our administration can be considered imperfect, which is gender and caste and religious discrimination and so on. And we have quotas and other mechanisms, but even those kind of imperfect mechanisms make some difference, but not necessarily all in the right direction. The other aspect of it is, again, as public sector units are cutting down on employment, some of them are being sold. Government has not filled many of the vacancies in the health infrastructure or in the education infrastructure, and instead is relying on contractual labor, which pays differently and isn't bound by the same norms that government jobs are. These are going to become more and more important questions.
Absolutely.
But,
In fact,
yeah.
Ashwini Deshpande herself put out on Twitter today that there is this issue of, the railway jobs that were advertised for and the huge number of people who showed up for it. And, the point that she makes is that enormous number of people who didn't get jobs and left disappointed from them, left disappointed from that area, were not thwarted by reservations. They were thwarted by there not being enough jobs on offer. So that is a point again that really needs to be made more often.
And in fact, you say this in some research, most of Indian youth apparently wants a government job, not a job in the rapidly expanding private sector.
Absolutely. I think, the stability that people observe and the lack of it that they observe in private sector jobs makes it a no-brainer for most people across age groups, that remains the government job absolutely remains the most preferred form of work. And in a sense, it also sort of gets to the issue of these contentions around new groups seeking to be included in affirmative action, because the stability and the income mobility that a government job can offer, and also the sort of softening of social inequalities that a government job can offer, make it something worth fighting for.
I think, it's a point that a lot of our policymakers need to consider very deeply. Is that 30 years after economic liberalization and kind of the slow decline of the public sector in many industries, and has not been replaced by kind of a private sector that's very dynamic, that's creating manufacturing jobs, that's creating jobs that are appropriate for the population that we have, for the demographic dividend. And while kind of there are very good reasons why the public sector is declining in size, and there are very good reasons for selling companies like Air India, or it's not sufficient to think about the economic efficiencies of such decisions, but also talk about the impact of such decisions on people in India. But just switching tack a little bit. Again, we are kind of nearing the end of our 1 hour, and I promise we'll just go about 10 minutes extra for just because the conversation is just so fascinating. But one of the things you've done a lot over the last 2 years, as a lot of people have, is health journalism, and specifically focused around the pandemic. And I did want to get to that point. And we ran a survey. Again, we ran a poll on COVID cases in India. And again, our audience is broadly right that India reported officially 35 million COVID cases had reported by January 1st of this year. And the cumulative official death count was 0.48 million. So India thinks, or the Indian government officially puts out data that says about 5 lakh people have died from COVID in India. But what I do want to kind of get to is the reality that, and again, I'll just quickly go through this material, is you point out that that a lot the data indicates that India has just 6 hospital beds for every 10,000 people, against the global threshold of 18. And in some poor states, that number goes down further. And this is just hospital beds. We're not talking about oxygen or ICUs or all the other infrastructure, doctors, nurses, staff, all of that goes with it. We also have a history of undercounting our deaths in our country. And you've kind of placed this in the book, that the malaria deaths are, the difference is staggering, that the official National Health Profile says about 200 people died from malaria in 2017, and an estimate, scientific estimate, kind of indicates 50,000. But when we headed into the pandemic, we were running this kind of infrastructure, both health infrastructure as well as data infrastructure. We were only registering 9 out of 10 deaths. Some states were capturing less than half. And again, there was a systemic kind of error towards undercounting women's deaths when death registrations were counted. So essentially, I think, and this is the point, what I want to get to, is the Indian state is not counting the deaths properly, not providing the health infrastructure, and yet is claiming a COVID pandemic death rate that's much lower than global, even for countries with better health infrastructure. And we have seen logic such as India has a younger population, or India is more exposed to all kinds of organisms because of our living conditions and so on. Or, I mean, we have some other natural way of immunity and so on that protects us. There's a lot of narratives around this. But in your book, you say that this narrative needs to be seen in the light of the definition that Indian states have adopted. So could you maybe first talk about this, and then we could go into published research that talks about the actual COVID impact on India?
Sure. So I actually think that we're going to end up looking back at that period around during the first wave and maybe just after it with a lot of shame about the conversations that that we were having, and that moment in particular, that trough between the first and the second wave, should have been a moment to better understand the pandemic as it had played out in India, which perhaps could have given us some tools to better deal with the second wave, instead of sort of launching into some amount of self-congratulation, which is what happened then. And I think the reason that this happened is because we meaning not me, but many people expended much more energy in trying to understand what made India exceptional than in trying to understand what made the Indian data exceptional. And I think that that was a big miss right then. So there was no explanations around things like the BCG vaccine or innate immunity were not things that were backed by science. And when it became apparent that there wasn't science to back this, we should have sort of abandoned that and pursued the question of why it was that we were seeing such low numbers. And I do want to make the point that there are two sets of processes that went on here. One was a legacy issue. As you pointed out, we have a history of death undercounting, as many countries with underdeveloped health infrastructure and administrative infrastructure do, which is, your system is still immature. It needs to come to a point where disease surveillance gets good and then death registration becomes strong. Some states do a better job of it, and they're there as models for us. So those were legacy issues, and not new to either this administration or this pandemic. But this excessively stringent definition that India adopted was not something on which there was any rethink at any point. Although the official definition was closer in line to the more lenient definition that the WHO had, which is that even suspected death should have been coded and included. Once it became apparent that this was not happening, as reporting by me and others from multiple Indian states during the first wave showed, I believe there should have been, greater energy expended in reiterating the point to states that more, artificially inflating numbers was not a problem, while artificially depressing numbers would have been a problem. I think typically in India, all of the response to numbers, whether it is crime or disease, tends to be that big numbers are bad, and you criticize and penalize the states that report large numbers, rather than thinking that perhaps they are the ones doing a better job of reporting, which is, an endemic problem with how the media compares Indian states. So, I think the wrong questions were asked after the first wave, and a combination of legacy issues as well as pandemic specific issues led us to a point where we had unnaturally low numbers and not good enough explanations. And then, of course, the second wave hit, and the excess mortality issues became more apparent then. So I'll let you get to that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is probably the saddest part of our session today, and I do want to kind of say that we are still in the middle of the third wave, and thankfully the impact has not been as dramatic, and we have been spared the absolute trauma of previous year. But one of the kind of key things here is that these stories are in the public domain now, thanks to yourself, a lot of data volunteers, a lot of journalists that found innovative ways of getting around to the true number, irrespective of what the administrative record was saying. So these quotations are from a recently published paper in Science, and with a lot of very reputed scientists and academicians contributing. So this paper suggests that the official death count is a significant undercount, is an undercount of by about 6 to 7 times, and there have been other estimates as well. But kind of the way this story was told in those months, in very tragic months, was that journalists actually employed very innovative ways of arriving at how many people were dying, and that speaks to the the ability of our um, relatively weak or weakening journalistic infrastructure, where people actually went to, there were stories in Bangalore where journalists went to crematoriums and sat outside and counted the number of ambulances that came in. There were stories from Gujarat where people counted the number of obituaries published in local newspapers. There were journalists that went to local municipal bodies and actually used RTI and other mechanisms to access the death registers. There were people who visited hospitals and spoke directly to the doctors or those people certifying the deaths at the hospitals. And there were also statistical analyses of all the data patterns, the reporting patterns across various states. So I think, I mean, the key point I'm kind of trying to make here is it's very important to, irrespective of what the administrative record says, to find innovative and new ways of getting at what the actual story is. And yeah, would you comment on that?
Absolutely. I do think that, see, there's very little to be sort of celebratory and triumphal about the second wave at all, which is a sort of, shared traumatic moment in recent history. But one of the silver linings to it was the role of journalists and local journalists in particular, who, journalists in non-English newsrooms who function under much greater pressure with much less money, and, did all of this impressive work. So, just as you pointed out, journalists from multiple non-English newsrooms and English newsrooms in particular tried to do this sort of work, which is that they were seeing that their cities and towns were clearly reporting far more deaths than what the official statistics were showing. Many of them were seeing it within their own families and communities, and just felt that this couldn't pass this way. So, they were doing the crudest form of data journalism possible. And I don't mean crude as a pejorative term, but in terms of how the numbers could be collected, which is you go to the crematoria and you look at the actual register there and you compare it with what the official count was. So they, I think, waved the first flags that then allowed people to do the work that followed from it. And the work that followed from it was that journalists like me and others in the Hindu and other places looked at civil registration data on deaths from multiple cities and states to come up with estimates of excess mortality, which would be the difference between mortality in non-pandemic years versus these pandemic years, without directly estimating that these were missed COVID deaths, but while still saying that there were a large number of missed deaths. And the other thing that I feel was, a silver lining to all of this was that journalists like me and others, we put all of the data that we accessed on GitHub and made it freely available to other journalists and researchers across the world. So Prabhaja and others in the paper that's up on the screen here, for example, use this repository of data that me and other journalists put together. So, I think it was a sort of cascading effect from local journalists to other data journalists to academicians to produce something closer to a true estimate. And I do want to locate this also within other global practices, so that it doesn't seem like this is something particularly outlandish or unusual that we were doing here in India. Many countries have produced their own national estimates of excess mortalities produced by government agencies themselves. Most notably, South Africa, whose official medical body produces weekly estimates of excess mortality that even before this third wave, I have been looking at just for the sheer quality of numbers produced. So just for an example, the graphs that you have now in this third wave, which so many of us have relied on to think of the trajectory for India or for other countries, we've looked at these graphs from South Africa to think about how it will go. South Africa is able to produce for individual localities official cases, official hospitalizations, official deaths, and official excess mortality. So it's not, I just want to locate this as a normal and pedigreed practice, and not something outlandish or unusual that India is doing. It's just that in India we're having to do it through investigative journalism rather than through any sort of well laid systematic process, and we're having to do that because the data isn't being released to us.
That's quite a kind of a depressing note, but I do want to kind of ask you a question. You express a desire, and in conclusion, towards the end of
Mihir, you're on mute. Sorry.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah, I just wanted to close before we go to the Q&A with a question. So you have two different ways in which you say this in your book. One, you say that the central problem with official data is not falsification. It's not that the government or the surveys or the administrative records are being made up, but rather it is neglect, discredit, and dismissal of such data. So part of it is not releasing the data on time, not providing the right infrastructure to collect the data, and so on. And then you also mention a wish from a data journalist perspective that more data, better collection, greater openness, and more interrogation of the available data can be are essential for a democracy. So, I mean, I just want, in conclusion, one, to compliment you on the fascinating book and hundreds of data sources that you've put together in a very readable manner, but also to ask you, one, this data infrastructure in a country like South Africa has shown that it can be deployed, it can be fixed if there's a desire to do so. But as a data journalist, again, like it's a question that's important to ask, and it's a wish list that's not just from a journalism perspective, but as a citizen of a democratic republic, as a voter, something that we should demand. So you want to kind of say something about the data availability and that aspect?
Sure. And the reason that I feel that some amount of that throwing these wish lists out and talking like this about it can have some possible impact, and this isn't some sort of pie in the sky thing to talk about, is because we do know that there are parts of India that are able to maintain fairly decent data, and we know that they have it and they look at it. What we need to get to is that next step of making it public. So just for example, in the last few weeks, you'll have noticed multiple cities and states, including Bangalore and Karnataka, coming out with, a few lines or quotes from officials saying that the large majority of people who need oxygen beds or ICUs or ventilators during this wave tend to be the unvaccinated, and they're saying this based on data that they have for people by their vaccination status. Now, it's great that we have this information because it hasn't even been clear all this while that we've been tracking people well enough in our data to understand, outcomes based on vaccination status. But that, and I wrote about this recently for India Spend, and I could find 5, 6, 7 officials in multiple cities or states who would give me this as a quote, and they'd even come on record and say it. But that next step, that can you just give me the data that you are using to produce these percentages? Can you show it to me in anonymized form? I have no interest in the people at all. I just need to see it for myself. That next step, nobody is willing to do yet. Not the cities that have the best data infrastructure yet. So that's something that I feel is a democratic gap. It's not a, if we had huge gaps in data collection, systems, IT, technology, then there'd be a whole lot of work to do. But that's not it. The gap is in that democratic process of making it making it clear both to citizens and to officials that this is a democratic right. I don't think people feel entitled to ask for this data themselves, and then I don't feel the government feels obliged to give us this data either. So for example, Mumbai produces a beautiful COVID dashboard, but it's a PDF that updates every day, and when I asked for the data behind it, they said, nobody wants the data behind it. If you want it, you'll have to write to us separately. I mean, you have the Excel sheets there which have helped you create that graph. That next step of transparency to make that data available, that's, it seems small enough to be achievable, and maybe if some state does it, then it will set an example for others to do it as well.
I think your wish list is at least in this case mentioned to a good audience, because the Takshashila tends to attract, and we have a lot of policymakers, policy analysts, want people who are in government or want to be in government. So I'm sure there are listeners here who kind of understand the request and the agony of not having the right access to data, and hopefully we can make a difference at the margins by getting some data made available. We're going to go to a couple of questions, Rukmini. If there's one you would like to pick, I will just start with one. And it says that you did a fascinating job of looking at the data from different angles. Despite this, comments and analyses on the LGBTQ community did not come up in the book, except that there was a small section dedicated to how Indians love. Do you think is this because there is a dearth of data, or was this a deliberate decision?
It's very much because there's a dearth of data, and even the part that comes up in the surveys that I do use in the section on changing views on Indian acceptance of same-sex relationships is not the best data. I wish we had better data. So what we have is like one question that's asked in one international survey, and we've seen changes in that one over time. But we have absolutely next to no information about this. And all that we have, again, is sort of broad willingness to accept same-sex relationships. And it's asked in a laundry list that includes, do you think it's acceptable to be a tax evader? Do you think it's acceptable to get on a bus without buying a ticket? Do you think it's acceptable when two people of the same, when two people are in a same-sex relationship? That's the way it's asked. This is not a great question. It's not a great way to collect data. So really, that's the only limiting factor. I would love to say more about it. And in fact, it's something that should be studied better, because it is my sense, both from this limited data as well as anecdotally, it's my sense, and it could be proved wrong, that there is a greater acceptance of same-sex relationships. There is an improvement in it over time, and there is perhaps a softening of some of the hostility about it. So what worked here? Was it the decriminalization that worked? Was it largely positive media coverage? Because the English media is pretty positive about same-sex relationships. Is that what worked? Did pop culture have an impact? Did key figures coming out have an impact? We don't know any of this. And if this is an important shift in otherwise conservative positions, it deserves to be studied better.
Thank you. I want to go to a combination of two different questions we have. One is that data sources have become more available, and therefore data journalism has become popular or possibly feasible in many cases. But there is a sense that there is a changing source of truth, that a lot of people exist that trust things that get forwarded in WhatsApp groups or that get said in social media, and then it creates a polarization or a trust deficit. And then there's also the difference between these kinds of narratives, these may be called received wisdom, versus the realities that are indicated by the survey data or the administrative data. So this has significant implications for public policy. It doesn't just matter what the truth is or what the truth may be based on the data, but it also matters how people perceive that, and whether that goes to polarization or the trust deficit aspect. So in that sense, like, how do you see this kind of misinformation challenge as a data journalist?
That's a great question. It's a big challenge, but I think it's important to consider something before we think about how to tackle it, which is that what happened in the past. I mean, misinformation did exist before the internet and social media as well, and there were parallel sources of the truth available to you, including, caste and tribe leaders who played a much bigger role, the role of the family. All of that did exist then. And what is it that gave credibility to either the news or those in the dealing with data? What gave credibility? It's important to consider those pathways to think even now about what gives credibility, because and I have had people write into me after the book to say that we're glad to have this book because it helps us in arguments on our WhatsApp groups with our families. And I'll be very interested to know how those arguments go, because I don't have a lot of conceit about the role of data journalism in changing minds beyond bubbles. I don't have a lot of faith in the role of journalism, even because you can choose who your media is depending on what you wanted to tell you, and you can decide that that is the truth. And then nothing else will change your mind because you feel like you have an alternative set of facts. I think we've all seen this played out pretty strongly in the pandemic when where the misinformation sort of overload has reached the point that people feel that they can argue things uh, like whether vaccines protect or not. They do. And it's I am not making that argument at all, because I see it as an indisputable fact, but this is the whole that misinformation has had. So I see what I'm doing, but I can't say that I see a clear pathway into this data necessarily playing a role in changing minds. And I'd like to think more broadly in terms of credibility, because whatever builds credibility for broader sources of information and the media should hopefully apply to data as well. And I think one of the things that works there is being less polarized in your communication as well. Um, Coming at it from cherry picking facts to support one narrative alone might help you when you're preaching to the choir, but it's not going to help change minds beyond your bubble. So I would recommend that for data journalism as well, to be sort of less polarized in the arguing of the point.
And I think your book, you do that quite a bit. You present, for example, when you talked about the consumer expenditures, you talked about how the left views it, how the right views it, and different ways of looking at the same data and reconciling. And you do that in a lot of different places in your book. So I think that's an important thing, that the ideological polarization or biases that might come in, it's important to address them when the narrative is being told. We have another question, and this is one that I think we should pick up, is that you have an insight that households that spend more than 8,500 rupees a month are rich in some sense, going by some of the data. And that means that a majority of the people that are participating as listeners today are very likely kind of in the top 1% or the top 5% of folks in India. And that the interactions that we perceive with people around us, such as household helps and other interactions within urban India, whether it be with an electrician or another person that we engage or somebody we meet on the bus, all of those are very likely middle class and not truly poor. Is what this question is. So the questioner says, could you talk about this insight a bit more, that we don't really understand the extent of poverty in India, the extent to which people have low income?
Yes, so that is where this data should lead us to think, and we are absolutely the top 1% of this country talking over here. I think what's helped me is to try and move beyond what are pre-decided categories. So I think we are sort of encouraged to think of the poor in terms of BPL and use that percentage as what we should think of as the poor. And I don't think we need to follow that, because I think that is a sort of line of deprivation, which perhaps matters for government policy, but does not need to matter for the way we think about the country. So if you want to make your own conceptual category of what you think a tough life would be, if you think that a person who had to run a household on less than 20,000 rupees a month would be someone that you think is poor, because from running your household how tight would that would be. Feel free to do that. We don't have to feel constrained by these categories to decide how we interact with the world. And yes, I do think that the way I have come to draw these lines sort of fits with what the questioner is mentioning, which is I see the way India is divided in terms of the government's definition of poor, then essentially the non-poor who are not in the government's definition of poor, but who are, that's all that you can say in terms of incomes. And then the super rich. That really is how skewed and odd our income distribution is. And yeah, we've got to stop thinking of inequality in terms of the top 20% versus the rest, and really think of the top 0.1% versus the rest. And someone was mentioning this to me that we have so much research on scheduled castes and scheduled tribes and the poor, and we have so little research on the rich and on upper castes. And perhaps this is an important area of research to pursue, so that perhaps we know what the lives of the poor look like, but perhaps we really don't know what the lives of the rich look like. And maybe we should be understanding and counting and measuring them much better.
I do want to go to a next question, and this is one that I think if the audience has a member that has asked the question reads your book, they will find the answer within. But I do still want to ask this: is how do you ensure as a journalist that the data collected that you're relying on is accurate and factual and doesn't have a bias? Because there's clearly a possibility that the assumptions behind the data, all the different processes of gathering the data could have led to a biased or inaccurate data source. So I do want to kind of, before even you answer the question, I do want to come in and say that one big part of being a data journalist or being someone who analyzes data is to know how to gauge the quality of data, how to cross verify the data against other sources that you've looked at, how to kind of look at time trends over data, how to look at geographic differences that may actually indicate that certain data may be inaccurate. And kind of how to tell a good story. That maybe one way to think about it is you may have to abandon a potentially good story because the underlying data doesn't hold up. So you do a lot of this in the book. You don't kind of rely on one source. You're cross-correlating, verifying, looking at time and geographic differences. But is that a problem as a journalist, or?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for setting me up with this. I think one of the useful things that has happened to me as a journalist is editors encouraging me to think of my job not just in terms of reporting on the data, but reporting on how the data was produced. And I find myself, more and more sort of committed to this, to the point that if I don't properly understand how a data set was produced, what that indicator exactly means, and how it was collected, I find myself unable to really write about it. I need to understand it perfectly to be able to write about it. And that very process has ended up yielding, not just, as Mihir says, insights that have led me to change how I was reporting or even abandon the data that I was reporting. It's also been a very fruitful sort of journalistic endeavor, because some of this has produced important results. So, for example, and this is really an example that fits perfectly with what your questioner is asking. After the 2012 Delhi, sexual assault, I was hanging around in the offices of the NCRB, the National Crime Records Bureau, because so much of our, focus at that time was on crime statistics. And just through a sort of related and tangential conversation, an official there who dealt with statistics ended up telling me about the principal offense rule. And what that is a system of classification followed by India's crime statistics, where only the quote unquote most heinous IPC section in any crime makes it to the official statistics. So if a crime involves sexual assault but also ends in a murder, as the 2012 case was, it only makes it as a murder to the official statistics. And the argument there is that this is to, avoid inflating numbers, because otherwise it will seem like double counting. But of course, there's ways to get past that. Again, I do want to reiterate that this is not something bizarre that India alone follows. Some other countries follow it too, but we never put it out there. It didn't exist in the sort of disclaimers in the NCRB until I wrote about this. They got very angry, but then they did put it in the disclaimers after that. So yes, that process of turning the lens onto the data is very important. And particularly in the case of opinion polling during elections, which is an absolute minefield, being very clear about who has commissioned it, who funded it, and the exact methodology is important. And what ends up happening there is that then there are a lot of opinion polls that I cannot write about because they refuse to tell you their methodology. They won't tell you even who commissioned it. Even though they are reported on, the media will co-present that opinion poll with a hyphen in the middle without having paid for it themselves. So all that we can do is sort of set a norm among other journalists in the media and sort of try to jointly accept that we won't report on surveys, for example, that don't disclose their underlying data or methodology. But that's the best. That's the best you can do. Set a bar for yourself and not go below it.
I want to get to a related question, and I know we are way over time, but maybe one couple more questions if you have time, Rukmini. The first one is, could you comment on the status of civic tech organizations and what role they play in supporting data journalists in the Indian context?
Great question, and I'm very happy to talk about this. This is again this is a good news story. So one of the great outcomes of the last couple of years has been these intersections between public spirited people working in tech and journalists and researchers coming together to create public goods. So sometimes this happens in a haphazard sort of way, which is that I'm working on something, and now as an independent journalist, I don't have access to a newsroom that might have a developer who could help me with the tech side of things. I have no tech skills myself. So anything that needs scraping or that needs anything more than what Excel can do, I'm usually stuck. So sometimes if I put this out as an appeal on Twitter, mention it, there'll be people who write in and say, how can we help? And, spend some of their time after they've worked late into the night to scrape data and put it on GitHub or somewhere and share it with me. This is something that I relied on in the pandemic as well. And I, always credit the people who helped me with this. But this is also happening in a more systematic way. There are organizations willing to partner with journalistic organizations to help them with the tech side of things. There's also all of the great partnerships that have happened around COVID. So one of the silver linings again of the last 2 years was COVID-19India.org, which was a sort of loose collective of volunteers, many of whom worked in tech, who remained anonymous and just pooled their skills in together to bring in official COVID data in a usable fashion, since it wasn't available from the government at the time. And after they shut operations at the end of October 2021, some other organizations, including one group of volunteers that I'm part of, have sprung up to sort of bring these together. And the organization, the volunteer network that I'm part of, does rely on a couple of civic tech organizations to help with the tech and with the API. So it's important, I think, to think of more structured ways in the future. Maybe there is a space for underfunded newsrooms and independent journalists to team up with civic tech organizations to work together to do better data journalism.
Thank you. Thank you again, Rukmini, for a wonderful session and a fascinating book that you've put out. 10 chapters, about 25, 30 pages each. A lot of data, a lot of insight, densely packed, but very, very readable, very accessible. It's not econometrics or very complex statistics that one is looking at. One is looking at stories interspersed with data and state of Indian lives in various different dimensions. I think it's an important book, and it's already on the bestseller list. I hope it stays there for a long, long time. Some of our audience will definitely go out and get and enjoy it. I think your book is a major contribution in the sense that it uses data sets from the government itself, from private bodies, surveys, all kinds of different methodologies of collecting the data. And it explores the old fault lines that exist in any society. In Indian society, those fault lines are gender, caste, religion, age, sexual preference, all of those different dimensions exist. And in a democratic republic that is kind of based on the idea of equality and of fraternity, we also see that there's a lot of social division along some one or more of these axes that still drag down Indian society in a variety of ways. And you write that India is largely conservative in many of the views, and but it's changing in very encouragingly in certain dimensions, as you mentioned. So I think in that sense, what we can say in conclusion for today is that our republic has made a lot of progress over 70, 75 years. While the income distribution chart may show that there's a lot of inequality, when we started, we had practically nothing. We had famines in the early decades. We had wars. We have had a lot of turmoil in our country, and we've come past that. We've kind of become a democratic republic that's able to generate enough food domestically and export. We have like high points of our industry is in among the world's best in certain domains, and our workforce works the hardest. So if we are able to provide as a democratic republic the right public policy and the right infrastructure for this hardworking young workforce, there's definitely bright days ahead. And I think while your book does a great job of showing that there's hard work to do, I think there is a lot of promise in our young people, policy professionals, government, and so on. So your book kind of serves as a guidepost along the way, and I hope you get a chance to write more books in the future, and maybe if you write a sequel 10 or 20 years down the line, that the data will show substantial improvements. It'll be a different story. So with that, I do want to conclude for this Thursday evening. I want to thank our audience, most of whom have stuck around for the full 1.5 hours, and it's been a great conversation. Thank you, everyone, and have a very good evening ahead.
Thank you for having me.